Yes, I'm looking for the embracing moment, the moment at which the field, the electrical energy, actually, we'll say, touches the human body, and hence creates a change in the body, so that the body is aware that there's something that's in its environment, and has the potential to cause an effect. You know, when you think about it. Light, for example, the light leaves the sun and it begins traveling to Earth, and it takes many minutes for it to come, and you could be looking and not see the light until the moment the light actually enters the eye. And even after it's entered your eye, you still don't know it's there. It's got to travel to the back of the eye and interact with a special cell in the back of the eye. That triggers a series of changes. This is a process that we call transduction. It's a changing of the energy from light into the language of the body. That change occurs, it results in a signal to the brain, then you say, I see. It works exactly the same way for electrical signals, like signals that come from a mobile phone. The theory, based on the evidence that we have produced so far, is that this embrace takes place exactly the same way that it takes place for other ordinary stimuli, light, sound, touch, for example, and it consists of a process whereby the stimulus, the electrical signal, for example, interacts with a specialized protein on a special cell in the body. I mean, there are these special cells in the body for detecting stimuli. The body detects light with specialized cells in the eye. It detects sound with specialized cells in the ear. Well, it also detects electrical signals from cell phones, for example, via specialized cells. And it detects them in the same way. That is to say, the immediate consequence of detection is a change of a particular protein, the net result of which is ions in the body move from outside the cell to inside the cell. That's the classic way a signaling cascade begins, resulting in a message to the brain, which the brain can interpret as something out there. The earliest consequence that occurs after the signal interacts with the specialized cell that detects its presence is what's called a neural impulse, a signal that travels along the nerve to the brain, to the central nervous system, and the brain then processes that information and orchestrates whatever the compensatory response ought to be to protect the organism. A good example would be if the stimulus were a heat. Now, if the stimulus were a heat, there would be certain cells in the body that would perceive the heat. The information would go to the brain. The brain would then analyze the information and then turn on the compensatory mechanism, which for heat might be opening the pores so that the body now is able to get rid of heat. Right. And so that's the standard stimulus response system that takes place at an automatic level. You don't think that this is hot, therefore I'm going to open my pores. It's an auto-regulatory process that takes place in the body. It's highly dependent on the nature of the stimulus. If the stimulus, for example, were heat, I just explained one compensatory response. If the stimulus were cold, then the compensatory response would be to turn on the shiver response. So your body begins to quiver and hence makes more heat. The point is, there is this neuroendocrine-based system. It's a system comprised of the nerve and various endocrine organs, and it has evolved over eons of time in order to take in information and to make changes in the body to best accommodate this information. If the information that you took in was the sight of a lion who happened to be walking across your path, then one of the compensatory mechanisms that's going to be invoked is your ability to run very fast, much faster than you would have run otherwise. Well, there's a biochemical basis for that, for why you're all of a sudden able to run so fast where you never ran that fast before. There's this very famous insight that was generated by Hans Selye, a very famous physiologist and physician. Back in the 30s and 40s, I think this work actually began. It's called the stress response. And the singular insight that he had was that this system can be triggered by multitudinous diverse stimuli. That is to say, many, many different things that can be presented to the individual, but the biochemical changes inside are all similar. And they all have one basic goal, which is to protect the organism. It's a response adaptation process. Take one of the two examples I used earlier. Let's say heat. If you have an organism that is exposed to heat over a long period of time, there are certain phases with regard to health that occur. And initially, the body's compensatory mechanisms are turned on, and the body begins to cope with the presence of the heat. For example, opening the pores so that energy can be radiated. But if we ask ourselves, what happens if the heat is maintained? Does the body simply begin to cope continuously over a long period of time? Well, the observation is after a certain period of time, the body breaks down and some illness, something adverse takes place in that organism. Now, precisely what occurs depends not only on the organism, it depends on other factors in the environment. An animal that is heated for too long could develop various kinds of symptoms depending on what else might be in the environment. For example, if the environment contains some bacteria that cause pneumonia, what you could expect to see would be an increase in the pneumonia rate in the animals that had this heat stress. So you couldn't say that the heat caused the pneumonia, but you could say it brought it about by overtaxing the body's compensatory mechanisms, and that's why the pneumonia developed. Electromagnetic fields work exactly the same way. They make it more likely that you're going to develop disease because your body's compensatory mechanisms are being worked by the presence of the field. And I'm talking over long periods of time, not 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but 5 or 10 months, over a long period of time. Your body's compensatory mechanisms are taxed, and then they're taxed to some limit because your resistance is finite. It's limited. It's not infinite. When it breaks down, then a disease develops. And the identification of the disease depends not only on what we've talked about up till now, but also other factors that are in the environment. If you look at the scheme that I just described, a protein detects the field, it sends a signal to the brain then orchestrates a response. Now, if you focus just on the activity of the brain in that model, the brain is receiving electrical signals and sending out electrical signals. Well, the activity of the brain in doing that can actually be measured by putting electrodes on the scalp. And then you can distinguish, for simplistic purposes, we'll say two states. There's the state of the brain when the field is not present, and then there's the state of the brain when the field is present, hence the signals are going up and coming out. So if you apply a field, you measure the brain waves on the scalp, and you see differences due to the presence of the field, then you can be scientifically confident that the brain is actually responding to the field. And I have spent a lot of time studying this system at that level. It certainly does. That's the whole basis of the concern for public health, because all of the fields in the environment, mobile phones, high voltage power lines, microwave ovens, these fields are all what a laboratory scientist would call low. That is to say, they do not cause immediate and obvious effects. They are below the level of sensation. That's what the word low means in this context. And I'm talking only about low. I mean, the effects of high fields are trivial in comparison. particularly thermal effects. Now, ionizing effects have to do with electrical signals that come from other kinds of sources. Cell telephones don't make ionizing signals. High voltage power lines don't make ionizing signals. That represents a completely different form of physics and biology compared with what we're talking about. My reaction is the same as when I see someone smoking a cigarette. It's a conscious choice that an individual has made. I think it's an unwise choice based on our scientific knowledge, but that's, in my opinion, the individual's choice. The problem with mobile phones, however, is that unlike cigarettes, where the information that they cause cancer is now clear, the mobile phone companies have done, in my opinion, a great disservice by hiding the fact that the signal can lead to disease. When you look back at the cigarette companies, they didn't willingly disclose the fact that their product causes cancer, and I think the mobile phone companies are making exactly the same mistake today. It's been a hell of a ride. When I was a very young student, I made, in graduate school, I made some experiments. And I first observed what I thought were effects due to electrical fields. And I was challenged by people who denied the reality of the observations. They said that I was a poor scientist and I had done things incorrectly. And at that point, I found out something about myself. I was just not someone who was going to accept an authoritative statement that something was a certain way without being shown why I should accept that view and give up my view. So I learned that I'm the sort of a person who will pursue what I think to be the truth. And along the way, I acquired all of the skills that I need to do that. It's very difficult to defend a point of view which I think now is orthodox. But when I first advanced it 35 years ago, it was quite far from orthodox. So in order to stay alive, I mean, I was swimming around in the sea, and there were barracuda in that sea, and they had big, sharp teeth. And in order to stay alive, I had to develop certain skills. It's the reason I went to law school. So I have all the skills that I need in order not to be eaten, so I can survive to do the experiments to test the idea that I had regarding whether I was right or not about fields. So in answer to your question, the best thing that I learned was that I'm not afraid to stand up and fight. And I was really happy to find that out about myself. I'm not a coward. Science, for example, the question of health risks due to mobile phone fields is like anything else in this world. What gets done is what gets paid for. Scientists require money to work. The people who have money to pay for research today, 99 times out of 100 are the cell telephone companies, that industry. So the work that gets done tends to be work that is controlled by the scientists whom they control. So today you have in the world two classes of scientists. You have scientists who are essentially working, either directly or indirectly, for the industry. And then you have another group of scientists who manage to get money from some source other than the industry. Now, if you ask this group of scientists, are mobile phones a health hazard? The answer will be unequivocally, definitely no. If you ask this group of scientists, you will get a range of answers. At one end will be, yes, clearly so. And at the other end will be, we're not sure, but we deeply suspect there's a problem and we need more honest money for research. So, two groups, this group and that group, yin and yang, male and female, completely different groups of scientists, depending on whether they are compromised in whether they can give you independent opinions or are not compromised. That's the nature of science today in this field. In the 60s and 70s, there were two sciences. One was called biology and one was called physics. Chemistry was sort of a in-between, more like physics, and it had practical applications. But in terms of two fundamental sciences, you had physics and biology. Now, anything having to do with electrical energy, belonged with the physicists. The biologists wanted nothing whatsoever to do with electrical energy. Even today, you can look at the curriculum of the most prestigious universities in the world who offer degrees in biology, the various subspecies of biology. You look at the courses they take, and they take no physics. It's just not there. Well, the laws governing electricity, do you see, are in physics. So if you don't study physics, you can't do biology and incorporate electricity. Okay. However, you can, if you know about physics, you can do experiments. You may not know a damn thing about biological systems, so you make egregious mistakes in how you handle them, but you can formally do the experiments because you know how to make the electrical signals. You know how to control them. You know how to measure them. So there's this gap that developed between people who come from a physical science background, physicists and engineers, and people who come from a biological background. That gap still exists today, but less so. You now have people who are in biology who know enough about physics and mathematics to do sensible experiments. 30 years ago, that did not exist. So you only had one perspective, which was the perspective of the physicists. And when physicists write their equation, there's nothing in their equations that says, oh, electrical energy is going to harm people. It's just not in the equations. Therefore, they denied it existed. And I could give you a list of 8 physicists who have won Nobel Prizes who have made exactly these kinds of claims as late as 1995. A very hard-headed, cold, calculating, and ignorant view about the way the world works. But there's nothing to say that there aren't physicists who are cold and ignorant. They know the equations, but they're still ignorant. That whole dichotomy has lessened over the years. It's not as bad as it was. In 1973, 1974, it was strident. It was strong. So there was great opposition to the ideas that I'm expressing now. Now, the idea comes only from the people who work for the industry. It doesn't come from hardly anybody within this group of biologists who are not funded by corporate sources. Big change. When the body reacts to light or sound or touch, that's an important source of information about the environment. Having the body react to mobile phone fields or high voltage power lines is no help whatsoever to the body. It's a potential hazard we see now, but it's of no benefit. So the evolution never brought about a system for detecting those fields. Those fields didn't exist 100 years ago, so it's impossible that evolution could have created such a detection system. But the detection system does exist. I mean, the evidence for it is very clear. So we can speculate about why the body detects those fields. My personal opinion is that it detects the fields because it has proteins that are sensitive to these fields, and these proteins play some other role in the body, but they are vulnerable to man-made fields. When evolution put this protein in the human brain and conferred on it the function that it does perform to help the organism, when it did that, there was no evolutionary reason to think that there might be fields in the environment which would allow detection to occur and hence compromise the organism. It's just simply a vulnerability to the way the body has used what I call an electrogenic protein, a protein that can embrace the field. It's simply ironic the way this thing developed. From our work, the work of me and my colleagues, it's quite clear that what the brain reacts to is the change in electrical environment. So what do we mean by a digital signal? What we mean by a digital signal is in time there's no signal, all of a sudden it's on, and it's on for a certain period of time, and then it's off. That's what a digital signal is. It so happens that this electrogenic protein in the brain, this protein that embraces the external field, has the property of reacting to a change. So, 217 times a second, when pulses from the mobile phone are entering your brain, when the pulse turns on, that generates a signal in the brain. When the pulse turns off, it generates another signal in the brain. The brain isn't responding, so far as I know now, to the presence of the pulse, but to turning it on and turning it off. So therefore, in every second, since there are 217 pulses a second, you're getting 434 what we call evoked potentials in the brain, over and over and over and over again for however many minutes a month you use the phone. That's the ultimate source of the signal in the brain that compromises human health. In connection with understanding mobile phone fields, none whatsoever. I think they're meaningless with regard to that application. Several reasons. First, you need to understand where SAR came from. I was there when SAR was invented. Richard Phillips, Don Justison, Sal Michelson, Herman Schwann. These were men who created the SAR, whose mind gave rise to it. And the reason they did was because they were interested in developing microwave ovens and in understanding how to cook meat. And it's useful for understanding how to cook meat, but it has no application whatsoever that I have ever seen suggested or advanced for understanding mobile phones. It works for dead muscle. It has just no applicability, in my opinion, to live brain. Because the health risks associated with mobile phone fields have nothing to do with heat. So it makes no sense to say, I have a really great way of measuring heat when the measurement of heat is irrelevant to understanding health risks. Any measurement that you make that has no connection with what you're interested in is just a waste of time. It can produce a lot of data, and when the calculations of SAR are done, they can produce beautiful pictures, but they're all the pictures are arbitrary and the measurements are meaningless. I mean, it's quite clear that that's the case. I work actually in two departments, the Department of Orthopedic Surgery and the Department of Cell Biology. My formal training is in biophysics. My PhD is in biophysics, and I also have a degree in law. When I was a graduate student in studying physics at Syracuse University in New York, I learned about some very innovative and exciting research being done by an orthopedic surgeon to test ideas about the role of electrical energy in the body. I interviewed with him and began working in his lab, and that's where I performed my research for my dissertation, for my PhD, and I've worked in that area ever since. Perhaps the most important kind of knowledge we have is a deeper appreciation than that has ever existed before regarding the fact that the living organism, something that's alive, is alive because of electrical properties of the body. Electricity essentially is the factor that allows living things to do what they do, the laws of electricity. And we realize that now, and we also realize that there's a danger associated with sometimes forgetting the fact that a human being, for example, is an electrical animal. When we expose ourselves to man-made electrical signals and don't think about the consequences for health, we make a serious mistake. It's that appreciation, I think, that's the single most important thing. It's a form of energy. It's something real, something measurable, and in the context of a mobile phone, for example, it is the means by which the handheld telephone is able to communicate with a base station perhaps 20 kilometers away. The electrical signal is something that comes out of the cell phone and goes in two directions. One direction is toward the base station, and the other direction is toward the user's head. And that's the basis of concern about health consequences. It's not difficult. It's something routine. Before electrical devices ever appear in society as cell telephones or high voltage power lines or any other electrical device, they are always created in a laboratory environment, and their function is studied. The question really is, the answer really is that it's not difficult at all. It's just done routinely. It's difficult to provide a laundry list. It's like saying, the question is roughly equivalent to asking me, what can you do with sound, or what are the consequences of light? The simple fact is that electromagnetic fields, man-made fields, are perceived by the body, and as a result of this perception, this detection, an almost infinite variety of changes can occur in the body depending on other factors. The subject's genetic predisposition, other stimuli that are in the environment, and so forth. You can take many different kinds of measurements and find that they are affected by the presence of the field. Just as you can imagine many different consequences can occur when somebody is presented with light or sound or some other stimulus. The experiments that I've been doing go back to the first ones with animals were around 1970. So we've measured many different things: the growth rate of animals, stressor hormones in the blood. Many different things were measured in an attempt to begin to make sense of how these electrical signals affected the body. Now, at this point in my career, the focus is on brain waves, how external electrical signals affect the way the human brain works. But that's the end of a long line of research that goes back almost 40 years. The thing to be explained is, at least in my view, is how it can be that a human being who's exposed to electrical signals, a high voltage power line, a mobile phone, for example, over a long period of time, is more likely to develop disease than that person would be if the exposure weren't there. That's the thing to be explained. Now, an explanation for that involves some understanding of how the electrical signal gets into the body, how the body reacts to the presence of that signal, and how that reaction ultimately leads to disease. 3 separate steps. The work that I do now mostly focuses on the first 2 steps, how the energy gets in and how the body reacts. It doesn't deal with the latter stage because that's for other folks to do.